less than a week before the NFL draft, and a Chicago Bears wide receiver was arrested. What would you think about the team then maybe using both of their second-round picks on pass catchers for Justin Fields?
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook, join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk, and make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. BetOnline, where the game starts. On the show today, we'll be joined by friend of the show, Bryan Perez from the Draft Network, to break down everything that happened this weekend with the Chicago Bears, specifically yesterday, the arrest of wide receiver Byron Pringle in Florida. We'll look at what that move means for the Bears at wide receiver, sort of the latest falling in the Ryan Poles era so far of a few different things that just haven't gone the Bears' way in free agency since he took over, and kind of where that leaves things moving forward, particularly in this NFL draft. We'll look at this deep wide receiver draft class and go through the possibility of using both second-round picks at this position that's so strong in this draft, and also getting paid big bucks around the NFL as some of the top names keep getting moved everywhere. There's a lot of advantage to investing in wide receiver in the NFL draft. But the Bears have other needs too, so we'll kind of go through all the different dynamics at play here. Bryan is a great NFL draft analyst. He's been a Bears guy his whole career here and used to host this podcast, actually. And it's fun to catch up with him and break down this NFL draft with a guy who knows the Bears and the draft better than pretty much anybody else. Very pleased to be joined today by a friend of the show, former host of the show, longtime friend, Bryan Perez, not only a great Bears fan on Twitter, but a great NFL draft analyst for the Draft Network on Twitter at Bryan Perez NFL. Bryan, welcome to the show. It's draft week. It's holiday season. How are you feeling gearing up for the end of the week?
I'm feeling pretty good, Lorin. This is the time we've all been waiting for. Like you said, it feels like the holidays are upon us. Christmas Eve is coming. New Year's Eve is here. This is what Bears fans, unfortunately, have had to live for with the absence of consistent playoff runs or Super Bowl bids. The NFL draft is basically the crescendo of our year, the biggest event that we have to look forward to. So it's a lot of fun. And, hopefully this year with a new regime in place, it's going to lead to a lot of nice storylines as well.
Unfortunately, our draft week starts with some bad news, I guess, from Florida, where Bears wide receiver Byron Pringle reportedly arrested for reckless driving, doing donuts supposedly in a parking lot while his license was suspended. And it's just one of these things where it's like it's kind of a blemish on the free agent acquisition and the start of the offseason. But like, I don't know, is this, relatively speaking, as far as, I don't want to downplay the criminality of it, but like, is this something he's maybe even gonna be suspended for? How big of a deal do you think this should be?
I don't know if we're looking at like a league suspension, an NFL suspension, whether or not it rises to the level of violating team rules or something internal with Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus. Who knows? Well, that'll be yet to be seen, but clearly it's a red flag. Byron Pringle is a guy who, when he was coming out of Kansas State, fell in the draft pretty much significantly to late day 3, in part because he had some questionable background issues as a college prospect. And I'm not here to say that a bad decision in April of 2022 means that these issues that were present all those years ago are suddenly still there or are coming back or even exist. But it's obviously a red flag, right? You're talking about a guy who's less than 1 month or just a little over 1 month from signing a $6 million deal with $4 million guaranteed. He's got a chance to earn himself a multi-year lucrative contract, if not with the Bears, but with another team, proving the only thing that stopped him in Kansas City was the depth chart. and he's got so much to gain in 2022 to make such a questionable decision. And when you start reading some of the facts about having a child in the back seat while he was doing these things, it just raises doubt about moral character issues, questionable decision making. And when you're talking about a guy like Ryan Poles, one of his first major free agent signings, if it really even classifies or qualifies as that, to do something like this, a month on the roster, a couple days before the draft, it's the kind of ugly stain that hurts culture, that hurts a new regime, regardless of who Byron Pringle is as a player, his standing in the league. He's not a top-notch guy, a top-tier guy, an upper echelon player, but in the little bubble that the Bears fans live in, the little reality that we're in right now, Byron Pringle's kind of important, right? So when he does something like this, it does resonate through the entire offseason. It makes you question, well, maybe the Bears made a mistake hanging all of their wide receiver expectations on an unproven player like Pringle, who has some questionable background issues. They just signed a guy like David Moore, who the Bears are his fifth or sixth team. And are these the kind of decisions that Ryan Poles should have made? Now, up until today, I was fine with what he was doing at wide receiver. Not satisfied or completely content, but you can understand that he's signing guys that have something to play for in 2022. They're going to come into the season with that edge, that chip, that desire to prove they belong. And a lot of times you get really good results from that. Mm-hmm. And then it kind of just sours within a matter of a couple of hours when you see a guy like Pringle get arrested. So hopefully it doesn't have long-term ramifications for the 2022 season, but it's hard to imagine that this is something that just goes away. It might go away from the standpoint of he doesn't get suspended, but it's not going to go away, especially in the next week. I think this is going to send shockwaves through the Bears draft plans in the next couple of days.
Today's episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Athletic Greens. They're the makers of AG1. It's a great nutritional supplement to help you start your day off right. With one delicious scoop of AG1, you're absorbing 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food sourced superfoods, and probiotics and adaptogens to really give you the ingredients to support your gut health, your nervous system, your immune system, your energy, recovery, focus, and stamina, aging, everything. AG1 is the perfect start to your day. It's like taking a multivitamin, but it gives you so much more extra bonus, and it tastes good in powdered form. You scoop it up with a glass of water, and boom, you're starting your day on the right foot. Right now, it's time to reclaim your health and arm your immune system with convenient daily nutrition. It's just one scoop in a cup of water every day. That's it. No need for a million different pills and supplements to look out for your health. To make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs of AG1 with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/NFL Network. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/NFL Network to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. Bryan Pringle, not the first blemish for Ryan Poles this offseason, at least just in terms of like optics at the very least, with Larry Ogunjobi signed and then not signed, failed physical that, maybe should the Bears have known? I mean, that's why you have the physical to find out for sure. And then, trying to sign Ryan Bates as a restricted free agent and obviously ends up being matched by the Bills. And now Pringle, it's like with each of those things, it's like, well, should they have known about Ogunjobi? Is that fair to expect? Probably not. And same with Byron Pringle. Like, wouldn't have expected that he would get arrested, but at the same time, they said his license. The reports are that his license had been suspended since like February in Florida, so that could be something that maybe the Bears could have looked into more and had questions about, and maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But I don't know. Like, is this just bad luck for Ryan Poles, or how do you sort of view in the context of rookie GM in his first offseason here, having some bumps along the road?
I think it's like anything else in life, right, Lorin? One bad moment or incident or circumstance and bad luck. 2 bad moments or instances or circumstances, it's kind of like, is this now a pattern? And then if you have 3, it's like, all right, what's going on here? Like, this doesn't really add up, right? I mean, Ryan Poles cannot be held responsible for a bad decision that's made by another adult man. Like, it's not his fault that Byron Pringle went out and did something stupid. But like you said, was there any clues along the way that he should have noticed or could have taken note of that would have led him to say, this is a kind of player that might make a decision like what we're seeing tonight at some point in the future. So let's not make him the wide receiver we're targeting right out of the gate. Larry Ogunjobi, yeah, I mean, a physical is going to reveal something that maybe you would not have known until the physical. And I think Ryan Poles acted responsibly to obviously cancel the contract and protect the Bears' long-term interests. But it just feels like a stretch of bad luck that, luck is luck for a reason. It's just things that don't normally happen all that often. So when you have a couple of these instances happen, like within a span of 4 or 5 weeks, you got to start questioning, is it luck or is it just bad process, bad planning? Is there just it's obviously a learning experience for Poles. He's learning on the job, which is not something that should concern Bears fans. I mean, sometimes the best experience that someone can learn is by making mistakes, right? And I think Ogunjobi, while that's not necessarily a mistake by Poles, maybe it's going to make him change his process a little bit in next year's free agency and not go all in on a guy who suffers a really bad injury 3 months before hitting the free agent market. Maybe he won't go after a guy like Byron Pringle, who, look, there's red flags in his background. You know this, Lorin. When guys go into free agency, part of the reason why these NFL teams do such deep dives on players when they're college prospects is because those scouting reports still have relevance when a player becomes a free agent. Background issues when a guy is 22 and 23 and 24 years old still matters when he's 27 and 28 and about to make a lot of money, because sometimes guys just don't really change. So
Yeah.
that information was available to Ryan Poles about whatever the issues were about with Byron Pringle. Now, you could argue that
Pringle in
Poles
Kansas City too. Like, I think you
exactly.
like should have put it over.
Exactly. So, there is reason for concern. Concern has such a negative connotation to it. So I just think there's
Yeah.
reason to question the process for sure. And as we're getting closer to the NFL draft, the Bears have two critical picks at 39 and 48. You really hope that there's been some deep dives done on the guys that they can pick in those spots, because for an offseason that hasn't provided much headline transactions, 39 and 48, those are the big dogs that are coming to Chicago this year. Two guys that need to become starters from day one. And you'd hope that there is a very strong process in place in Hallis Hall to make sure no more surprises pop up. We don't want to have a Tevin Jenkins situation all over again, where a pre-existing back injury ends up knocking him out for most of his rookie season. Do we have confidence that's going to be the case, from Ogunjobi to the miss on Bates to now Pringle getting arrested? I don't know. I don't know if there can be that much more confidence right now in Poles than what the mistakes that Pace kind of took. Pace was risky. Pace drafted injured guys,
Yeah.
pre-existing injuries. So, and we saw that came back more often than not to be a bad choice. So hopefully there's a better process in place for the draft.
I was gonna say, at least for polls, the blemishes that we've seen so far haven't been like drastically like long-term consequential, right? With Ogunjobi, they get out of it. It's not like a Pace situation where they sign Ogunjobi and then in August or whatever, or in training camp, the foot injury is the problem and he misses time and you've already given him the money. I mean, and even Byron Pringle, yes, you already paid him, but it's only a 1-year deal. You're not locked into 5 years of a guy that might have some questionable decision-making off the field. So you sort of have him in the equation there at wide receiver. It's been certainly a committee type approach to rebuild that spot with Economius St. Brown and David Moore, like you mentioned earlier, with Darnell Mooney. And it brought up this idea you had been going back and forth on Twitter a little bit about maybe drafting more than one wide receiver to add to that group. I mean, there are bodies there now, but maybe using both second round picks. I mean, I don't know that the Pringle news moves the needle that much if he doesn't end up being suspended by the league. I mean, I think with or without the Pringle arrest, it's still in the possibility. What's your sort of case for drafting two wide receivers potentially with both 39 and 48?
Well, I think there's any silver lining with the Byron Pringle storyline is that it's the timing of it, right? This happened before the draft.
Mm-hmm.
The worst case scenario for the Bears would have been if 4 days after the draft, Byron Pringle got arrested. Maybe they didn't commit any of the second rounders to a wide receiver, waited till their third round, a guy who's coming in with maybe like that Riley Ridley type of scouting profile. And now you're sitting here saying, oh my God, not only do we have maybe buyer's remorse on Byron Pringle, but we also have regret for not spending a higher pick on a receiver, because had we known now what we know now, we would have had a different draft strategy. So the fact that it happened now at least gives the Bears a chance to potentially pivot and push the need for wide receiver higher into their draft plan if it wasn't already there. I think it's got to already be there. I know there's a lot of talk about the interior offensive line being one of the two picks at 39 or 48. And while I completely agree that if a guy like Linderbaum falls into the second round, he's there at 39, you slide him right in at center, put Patrick Lucas over the right guard, and now you have a starting 5 offensive line that you could feel pretty good about at least being slightly above average, right, in 2022. But if a player like Linderbaum is not on the board at 39 or 48, draft history tells us that you can find guards and centers on day 3. I mean, you can. Legitimate, competent, starting, average to above average guards and centers are cherry picked every year in the 4th, 5th, 6th round. So it's a lot harder, in my opinion, especially in this year's draft, to wait until number 71 or even later if you want to land a wide receiver who can make an immediate impact. The Bears have picks 39 and 48, 2 of the top 50 picks. And in this top 50 of the draft class, there's a lot of good wide receivers in that top 50. Once you get to pick 60 to 75, it's going to be like dropping off a cliff with the wide receiver talent. So if the strategy is we want to land multiple wide receivers who could potentially start in 2022 or could challenge for a lot of reps, you have to use 39 and 48 on them. I understand guys like Bo Melton from Rutgers, players like that, maybe even a Khalil Shakir, could drop into the 3rd round, even into the 4th or 5th round. So maybe you get lucky. But I would never go into a draft as a general manager banking on luck. I want to control what I can control. And if at 39 and 48, you can leave this draft with George Pickens and a Sky Moore, I mean, that's a home run. And now you go into the 3rd round at number 71 and pick your right guard. You're going to find somebody there, whether it's an Ed Ingram at LSU or someone else is going to be on the board who will immediately join the Bears roster as the most talented right guard prospect to start in 2022. I don't know if you could say the same thing if you wait until 71 to grab even that second wide receiver. I would be on board, especially Lorin. Look at what we saw this offseason. Christian Kirk and the money he made. You got Tyreek Hill being traded because of basically his contract. Deebo Samuel is going to be traded most likely because, or maybe not, maybe he'll sit out. But again, contract issues. A.J. Brown, the rumblings of a trade. DK Metcalf. You kind of got to get a guy now on a rookie contract. This is becoming the new running back. You get the guy in the rookie deal, play him 3 or 4 years, max out his value. You flip him potentially into a higher draft pick before you have to pay a second contract. If you get 2 of those guys in this year's draft, you get 2 rookie contracts, plus a Darnell Mooney, plus a Byron Pringle, plus a David Moore. I said on Twitter, let the depth chart work itself out between 2022, 2023, 2024. You could be cooking with some pretty good potential on offense if you do that. If you keep kicking the wide receiver can down the road, I fear we're going to see an era of Bears football like we saw before they traded for Brandon Marshall, before they traded for Alshon Jeffrey, when the wide receiving core was it was basically as bad as the quarterback situation was in Chicago for many, many years. Wide receivers, you could find them. There's a lot of them. But the top tier guys still are difference makers, and you got to invest high draft picks on them. And look, Lorin, you know this as well as I do, and every Bears fan listening to this has to be about Justin Fields. We cannot have Justin Fields go into a season and outside of Darnell Mooney, he has a bunch of journeymen trying to earn a second contract. I mean, we can't let that happen to a quarterback who's the most talented quarterback the Bears have ever had. The other argument is he's going to do nothing to help the team if he's constantly avoiding pressure. So we all know that, right? Your offensive line is only as strong as its weakest link. So you have to make sure the right guard spot is a capable starter. But they could find that. Like, not only can they find that on day 3, that last final veteran wave of free agency in June, July, right before training camp, they'll pick up a guy who could start. Yeah. It's a lot harder to get that wide receiver. So I would be all in, man. If Ryan Poles comes out and says, look, we had high hopes for Byron Pringle, We still believe in him, but you have to question decision making. Can we count on him? If Byron Pringle makes another bad decision and he's gone, what are we doing here at wide
Yeah.
receiver? You got to get two guys in the second round at the very least. At the very least, they got to go 39 and 71 at wide receiver and let 48 be the best available offensive lineman if that's the strategy they want to go.
Before I started recording today's episode of Locked On Bears, I had a quick Built Bar to give me a little bit more fuel and to also satisfy my sweet tooth a little bit, because Built Bars are the world's best tasting protein bars. They taste like candy bars. They're not like some of those other protein bar products that are just sometimes hard to chew and get down. No, every flavor of Built Bar is soft and easy to chew, covered in 100% real chocolate. But most importantly, they're good for you. Every Built Bar is low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. There is not another protein bar product on the market just like it. And I'm telling you, when you taste it for yourself, you'll be a believer just like I am. I eat one literally every single day. Head on over to built.com, enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. It's easy to get excited about that when you look at the wide receiver class and how many different great guys there. You mentioned one pair, Sky Moore and George Pickens, as a potential duo. Do you like the idea of, mixing one of the more like a receiver, a shorter, quicker receiver like Sky Moore, or like a Jahan Dotson, or even like maybe John Mechie a little bit later on, with more the bigger, longer Pickens type idea? Or how would you feel about matching like Treylon Burks and that vertical speed with like Jalen Tolbert and just like firing them all downfield and trying to build almost like a Chiefs style of passing game? Like how would you like to balance the two wide receiver picks?
I think if you listen to Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks' draft podcast, they phrase it the best, in my opinion. You're basically building a basketball team when you're rounding out your wide receiver room. You want a guy for every role, the big contested catch guy, the downfield third level threat, the intermediate slot guy. And those players usually come in different body types. Now, you could have your big slot like a Treylon Burks, who doesn't look like the Sky Moore profile, but he could play that same style of game. Burks would be a great pick, by the way. If he's there at 39, I'm all in. But personally, I would like to diversify the body types with the two wide receivers they take. So a player like Pickens and Sky Moore, when you think about, you already have Darnell Mooney, who's even lighter and a little more slender than Sky Moore. And if you look at what Ryan Poles has already brought in, two guys around 6 foot, 205, who run a 4.45. That's Byron Pringle and David Moore. They're very similar in terms of their physical makeup, their speed, and their ability to win basically on all three levels of the field. So you have two guys that can kind of be diverse skills. You get a George Pickens who can win the contested catches, be a red zone threat, and honestly be like a true alpha. I mean, he could do everything. And Darnell Mooney would be, your ideal, that intermediate target who can also flip the field whenever necessary. Now you have a guy for every role. And don't forget about Cole Kmet if he breaks out in year 3 as a tight end. And, even David Montgomery coming out of the backfield. If you can diversify the pass catchers at Justin Fields' disposal, that usually results in the best possible range of outcomes. So to me, if they take two big-bodied wide receivers or two smaller slot type guys, you're basically like hedging your bet. One of these two guys will fill this role moving forward. That's not a bad strategy because we know NFL draft picks hit 50% of the time. So if you got two of them, you've increased your chance that one of these two guys will play this specific role for the Bears in 2022 and beyond. I get it, but I would rather diversify the makeup a little bit.
You mentioned earlier the drop off as you get a little bit later in the wide receiver class, and I'm curious, like how steep do you see the differences between like the Pickens, Moore, Burks of receivers to farther down like like Calvin Austin from Memphis or Alec Pierce from Cincinnati? I mean, depending on how everyone has these receivers shaped out, even Khalil Shakir, like those guys have some real like home run potential, but it's not you don't feel as high on some of the floors for some of them. So like, I don't know how much of a drop off do you see there compared to like previous draft classes?
So I don't see much of a drop. Alec Pierce. I think Alec Pierce is a second round pick. I think Alec Pierce is a guy, if the Bears want him, they'd have to take him at 48 because he's not getting the 71, right?
Yeah.
So, I think you'll see a guy like Calvin Austin there at 71. You'll see a guy like Wan'Dale Robinson there at 71. Jalen Tolbert will be there at 71. And that's where the drop kind of is to me. Now, Khalil Shakir is probably that last pre-71. Maybe he's at 71. He's like at the border of where this shift in you're going to get a guy who you really think can start to you're going to get a guy who hope makes plays in training camp and earns reps for week one. I think Shakir could be a starting slot receiver day one in the NFL. So that's probably where I would have the cutoff. So you're talking about, just running off a list here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You got probably 10 or 11 wide receivers who are all worthy of picks between 39 and 48, in my opinion. Now, 7 of them might be gone in the first round. So now you're sitting here, you're saying you got 3 or 4 guys in that range from 39 to 48 that you'd feel really good about in the second round. Not all 3 or 4, guaranteed. They're all gone by 71. So if 2 of those 3 or 2 of those 4 are still on the board at 39, you take one. And if the other guy's still there at 48, he's gone at 71. So at that point, it's just what will give our offense more returns in 2022 and beyond. Is it the wide receiver who we no chance will get at 71, or the offensive lineman who's in a cluster of players that have a chance of falling to 71? So that's why I think there's a chance. But again, Ryan Poles is a former offensive lineman. Ryan Poles talked all offseason about basically wanting to reinvent the way the offensive line for the Bears looks, their athleticism. I mean, he probably wants to rebuild that group. And if that's the case, he's going to invest his highest draft assets in the position, I would imagine. So we'll see. But yeah, the wide receiver group this year is very it's not like there's no Jamar Chase elite of the elite, but you got a cluster of 7 to 8 guys that are all going to challenge for first or early second round picks.
Yeah, it's a good year where the Bears' need happens to align with where there's going to be some level of best player available, kind of lining up nicely here. Bryan, really appreciate you joining us on the podcast today. Your Bears analysis and your draft stuff is as good as anyone can find anywhere on the internet. But tell everybody where they can find your work and what kind of things you're working on here for the draft season and beyond.
So obviously you can head over to the Draft Network. I cover the Bears for the Draft Network and over on Twitter at Bryan Perez NFL. And between me, you, and your listening audience, Lorin, I'm working on a new digital property called bearstalk.com. I'm very, very excited about this. You can head over on Twitter at the Bears Talk, give it a follow, and all the updates in terms of when that website will launch will be on there. We might even be live before the draft ends. A little spoiler there, but yeah, check it out, bearstalk.com, coming soon. Coming very soon.
You heard it here first. I'm looking forward to seeing how that goes together, Bryan. Again, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll do this again soon.
Thanks, Lorin.
Thanks again to Bryan Perez from the Draft Network for joining us on the podcast today. If you enjoyed our conversation, make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can be sure we'll be hearing more from Bryan here in the future in the podcast. Definitely want to have him on right after the draft, and might try and make something a little bit more regular throughout the offseason as well to kind of get more voices involved here on the show, and it's not just me talking all the time. But hey, we got a fun week ahead of us with the draft coming up right around the end of the week. We got the Bears pick now in the Ultimate Mock Draft 2022 on the podcast feed for the Locked On Podcast Network, our network-wide mock draft podcast. We put a bonus episode in it in the Locked On Bears feed last week, and now we're finally to the Bears pick that I picked for them at 39 in that mock draft. So if you search Ultimate Mock Draft 2022 wherever you get your podcasts, you can go through all the different picks in the first round, and then of course now we're just now getting to the Bears pick this week, so plenty more goodies to come that way as well. We'll go through all the different possible scenarios here for these second rounds, and whatever we have coming up for the rest of the week here, whatever happens in Bears news, there's always something coming up for this team leading up to this draft. So I hope you'll keep tuning in, and I hope the Locked On Bears podcast makes it just a little bit easier for you to bear down.